justified in this debate as well. Money from payday loan and now money from religious institutions. What are we earning today?
Just go aside.
Three contributions in this speech substantively, after one contribution in setup. First substantive contribution, why this was principally justified. Secondly, why this makes it significantly easier to leave religions, particularly very coercive ones. Thirdly, why this changes organizational behavior. Lot to get through, so let's start with setup. First of all, why we think this is likely to be done well. We think that we are just likely to do, we mandate in jurisdictions that these organizations operate in, that you go to your local priest and imam and you say, maybe this doesn't align with me anymore, I want to leave this religious institution. We presume that probably they try to talk you out of it because they care about your eternal salvation, but if at the end of that you really, really want to go through with it, they need to refund you the money that you donated. You can tell them, this is how much I think I tithed. They can say, by our records, here's how much you tithed. They are going to give you back that money. We are happy to set up like an ombudsman or some kind of overseeing regulatory body if that kind of transfer does not work. We're happy for it to go through the courts in cases where this communication potentially breaks down. Secondly, which money were we talking about in this debate? We are not talking about donations to religiously affiliated charities, because we would note crucially that lots of secular and non-religious people continue to donate to those. We were in this debate specifically talking about donations to the organization. These were things like paying your dues to an organization, or things like tithes that you might do at Sunday Mass. Notably, then thirdly, in terms of religious organization, we would simply note that a lot of these organized religions were incredibly liquid, had high retention rates, and were independently and historically wealthy, and therefore were likely to be able to offset this financial risk to them. First substantive contribution then on why this is principally justified. Firstly, why do people leave? The first reason that we think people are likely to leave religious organizations is because they have experienced trauma within those institutions and are likely to have become extremely disillusioned as a result. We would note that in these cases, getting your money back when you have been traumatized by a religion, when you have been traumatized by its institutional leaders, is a form of remedy that was crucial for you to get. And note crucially here that the vast majority of victim survivors of religious trauma and mistreatment will never be compensated for that trauma, because in order to do so, they often had to go through incredibly extensive, re-traumatizing and onerous processes that many people opted out of at their outset, or that they were simply beaten down by and then never reached any kind of compensation as a result. At the end of that, note that these religious organizations were often culpable for that trauma. That was things like being told that because you were gay, you were not human, or you were not going to go to heaven. That was things like being told that because you were a woman, you were inherently inferior and deserved to be treated badly. Those were traumatizing things that religious organization was inherently culpable for, and therefore it was just to demand that they compensated victims of that trauma. Note that this is an active benefit that we get that is unique to side affirmative. Second reason that people are likely to leave these religions, and probably the vast majority of people who leave, is simply because they have changed their faith, or they no longer believe in the thing that religion is anymore. And note crucially, people don't undertake this lightly. People care about their long-term eternal salvation. People cared about their relationship with the world, with nature, with God. So at the point where people left, they had probably thought about it very, very significantly. Crucially here, note that there are many cases where we believe that it is possible to enter into a contract, in this case, giving money, but where we do not force you to honor that contract because you were in a different state of mind then as compared to now. Notably, we allow no-fault divorces because we can understand that you might have loved somebody, that you might have cared about them very deeply, that you might have thought that relationship would continue for the rest of your lives, but now, 10, 15, 20 years down the track, you feel very, very differently. And we believe that you are allowed to leave that contract, but we also believe that it is principally just often for people to pay alimony, for spouses to have to redistribute the money that they may have shared that was put into that marriage because they were in a different state of mind at the point where they entered into it. At the end of all of that, note that in our worst case, where you were not compelled at all, we've proven that when you enter into a contract, it is still justified for you to leave. Notably, then, why were religions often coercive in the way that people engaged in them? A couple of reasons here. Firstly, perhaps you were born into it. Secondly, they had massive eternal salvation leverage over you, which was to say, they could tell you that maybe you were going to hell. But thirdly, that often your community was deeply entwined with that religious organization, and therefore it made it incredibly, incredibly difficult for you to leave because you were worried that it may stigmatize and shun you. What do we prove at the end of this? We prove, firstly, that if you were traumatized, we believe that you actively deserve compensation. Secondly, we prove that there are lots and lots of times where this aligns with accepted conceptions of where it is justified to let people break contracts and be somewhat compensated with their own money at the end of that. But thirdly, we prove to you that often this was incredibly coercive, and therefore you will be compensated for that coercion as well. Second substantive contribution then, why is it much easier for you to leave? First point here is a little bit of preemption, which is to say, they'll probably get up and say, well, now these religious institutions will work way harder to keep you in. 3 reasons that is not likely. Firstly, 10% of your income is likely to only be 0.0001% of a church or religious organization's income. And at that point, it was unclear that even though that money was incredibly useful to you and made a huge material difference to your life, that it had any kind of material impact on that religious institution. Secondly, that even if perhaps that money did make some small impact, the change in how coercive they were in trying to keep you in the religion was probably pretty marginal, because probably your priest already didn't want you to go to hell forever, and therefore was already pretty likely to try to keep you in that religion. At that point, because they didn't want you to be eternally damned, it's unclear to me how you can scale your don't want them to stay because they're going to be eternally damned, versus want them to stay because maybe we're going to lose a couple $100. I think you're probably pretty coercive in either world, but I do not think that the change is at all meaningful. But thirdly, because we still think that there is some level of oversight, and in fact in our we establish a level of oversight when we start promoting norms around the way that religious institutions or financially interact with their followers. Secondly then, we think that this makes people who are on the borderline of leaving, that is to say people who really want to leave an organized religion, but perhaps fear that there may be huge consequences to them for doing so, more willing to leave. The first reason for this was because we made it significantly more easy for you as a leaver to enact preferences that were being externally constrained. This was for a couple of reasons. The first reason was at the point where you had put significant amounts of money into a religious institution, you felt tied to the outcomes of that money, and you were constrained by the sunk cost fallacy, which was to say that you felt that you still had to remain within that religious institution because you had put money into it, even if you no longer believed in it anymore. But secondly, because you were very likely to predict that there will be a huge loss of community, and this seems like a huge risk that wasn't ameliorated by a financial cushion. That is to say that perhaps your parents would kick you out of your house if you told them that you were not religious anymore, but at least in our world, you had a cushion now, which was that you could get the hundreds of dollars you had likely tithed to that religion over your lifetime back. Maybe that paid for your first week of rent. Maybe that paid for you to start hire a car. Maybe that paid for you to get to work. And that meant it literally significantly financially enabled you to leave in a way that side negative never could. Impacts of this. Firstly, that in the most coercive and cult-like religions, where people were likely to have put huge amounts of money into these religions and were likely to be incredibly isolated at the point where we left, we gave a massive operational benefit to them because we transformed their ability to leave by giving them access to vast amounts of money that would make a significant difference in their lives. But secondly, that even in the less coercive religions, you were able to offset the risk of you leaving significantly more clearly, because you didn't have to stay in a faith that you didn't believe in. You didn't have to end up resenting everybody who you loved who had stayed because you thought they had stolen your money. You were able to leave. You were able to live a spiritually and financially fulfilling life. Vote AF.
An interesting claim when she's like, well, it's such a small proportion of money for the church compared to you as an individual that they probably won't try and convince you that much more to stay because it doesn't mean that much to them. And here I would suggest doing some addition, because at the point where they have to recollect funds from everyone, that probably adds up to quite a huge substantial portion of money, and that is probably something that the church just does care quite deeply about. But I reckon even if the church only cared 5% more about retaining their members, that probably means a 5% increase in things like huge amounts of guilt to those individuals that want to leave the church, noting the fact that the individuals that are likely on the precipice of leaving are the most vulnerable people in that debate, and that looks like things like your local pastor telling you that you're the devil if you leave. It looks like your local pastor using incredibly manipulative techniques on you to incentivize you to stay. So I think it is just untrue that it's only a small amount percent more that the church cares about you staying. That's obviously just incredibly uncomparative. 3 things, contribution from negative. Firstly, why we think the church actually does really good things with this money. Secondly, why it's unjust to take that money back. And thirdly, why people are coerced into staying directly responsive to like 6.5 minutes worth of that affirmative speaker's speech. Firstly, let's explain why the church actually does a good thing with this money. And I think an important piece of context here is noting things like zakat and tzedakah, which are a mandatory percent of your income that you must give in some Islamic and Jewish communities, which means that there's a huge amount of pressure for churches to spend that money in quite good ways. And that looks like things like, one, it's actually tied to their scripture. So it's like, if you're taking a percentage of that money, you have to then use that money in a charitable way. So that should make you believe that it's less coercive than corrupt than they explain. But second of all, you just need legitimacy amongst that community, so you also have those kind of incentives to spend that money quite well. And the impact of that is just massive, because I think it's really concessionary that Rose is like, oh, well, religious charities don't count in this debate. Maybe not, but there are obviously charities that religions themselves directly operate that absolutely count in this debate by virtue of the fact that the things I've just explained to you exist. And they do incredibly important work. Things like food drives and hospices and helping homeless people. And fuck me, I hate the church, but God, they do good things for the most oppressed communities that otherwise just don't have access to the kind of resources that they need in this debate. Secondly, what if it is coercive and guilt that forces you into giving this money? Because I think the first thing we would say is that we just don't really care, because the money is actually doing such good things that even if you as an individual are coerced into giving it in the first place, the amount that it actually helps that community outweighs that. But also there are other things in society that are coercive, things like tax, but we still force people to pay that because we recognise that the moral benefit of that tax is just quite high. Third part of this point, why do we think this money on their side would be directly taken away from charity? So why would it not go away from like the administrative fees? Why would it specifically be the charities that we care about that would lose out? That's firstly because it's actually really difficult for smaller churches to cut their administrative things and not pay their staff, which means the only option at their disposal to increase the money is things like increasing the amount of charity work that you do. But second of all, most churches aren't as centralised as the Catholic Church, for example. They're much smaller, they don't have a huge amount of liquidity. So the easiest thing for them to cut is the things that do the greatest amount of good, and that is things like charities. Fourth part of this point, why do we think this money isn't taken from the most poor and most vulnerable people in this debate? That's directly responsive to Rose. Firstly, the scripture mandates that you take a percentage of someone's means in a lot of these cases, so the people who are giving the least are the ones who also have the least, because it is a proportional percent of your income. So that likely means that it mitigates down a huge amount of their harms. Fifthly though, why do we think people who are more likely to leave the church are actually wealthier, the most privileged, and then don't actually need that money? And that's for the simple explanation that the more educated you are and the more liberal you are, the more likely you are to have the power and mobility to leave the church. So that means that even if those people do get that money back and that's principally good, they probably don't need it, right? Like maybe they need it some of the time, but I think most of the time, not the most vulnerable people in the debate, and they need to do a lot of work to prove why we should care about them that substantially. Finally, why do we think people are going to come collect this money, preempting any argument they're going to make at second? Firstly, we think that the church is just like wealthy and money driven, so obviously they have incentives to collect this money as do individuals. The individuals have incentives to do it. Second of all, at the point where it's a norm, people feel like they deserve that money at the point where they've left the church. But thirdly, when you leave the church, you have a huge amount of animosity. So this means that like anyone who leaves will collect. That means the church loses out a huge amount of money, and I've explained to you that that money goes to really important causes. That should just be weighed as the most high impact thing in this debate. Second of all, why do we think it's incredibly unjust to take this money? And the thing I'm going to explain to you here is that firstly, it's a really inappropriate way to give reparations, but second of all, there's just principled reasons that you should believe why this money is actually belongs to the church. Firstly, it's an inappropriate way to give reparations. Firstly, we note the fact that the amount of religious trauma people have isn't financial, so this is kind of like an indirect way to repair people, so we think the amount of benefit it has is actually quite small, particularly in the context I've just explained to you that the wealthiest people are the ones who are likely to leave the church anyway. But second of all, the amount of capital it would take to give back to these individuals means that they have less ability to do other more meaningful forms of reparations. That looks like things like, just doing justice to priests who've done things like sexual assault. It looks like things like doing apologies. It looks like things like reinterpreting scripture. They now have less ability to do that because they're instead expending capital and giving these financial reparations. But secondly, and more importantly, why do you principally think this money does actually belong to the church. And that's because, like, you have just conceded that money. At the point where you've given the money to the church, that is now their money. At the point where you give a gift to a friend, even if you have hostility in 5 years, that is still the gift that belongs to your friend. If you move countries, you don't then get your tax back that you've paid from that country from the last 10 years, right? Like, that is a sunk cost for you as an individual. So it is just unclear on a principled level why you do actually own that money, given the fact that you actually have willingly given up. And even if you have not willingly given it up, we think we can just outweigh this by explaining that, yes, obviously there is harm that the church has done to you, but there is also benefit that the church has given you. Probably as an individual, you've got a lot of meaning from being a part of that religion. You've got a community. So you have got some form of return for your investment. Maybe it's not tangible, but it's certainly emotional. And so that means that you have at least got something back. And so it's unclear why the church then has to give back to you again at the point where they've already provided you with a huge amount of emotional meaning. Thirdly, why do we think people are coerced into staying more? Note this is directly responsive to everything we hear from Affirmative about trauma. And there's a few reasons why that's true. One, obviously the church doesn't want to lose this money, and that's because, one, the most rich people leave, and so that probably means that they don't want to lose all out on that money. But second of all, just the sheer volume of people leaving means that the money probably would cause quite a huge dent in that church's bank account, and they probably do care quite deeply about, particularly local churches, for example, who are just in huge amounts of financial distress, that now have incentives to coerce people into staying in far more pernicious ways than they otherwise would. What do we think this looks like? One, things like emotionally guilt-tripping people and using, kind of weaponizing explanations that make them feel like shit. Second of all, it looks like preventing them from leaving when they first enter, so building in that prevention as a part of the way that they deliver their scripture, which actually makes it more pernicious. But thirdly, we think it looks like criticizing them and calling them greedy when they do choose to leave, which probably makes someone who was already vulnerable by virtue of the fact that they're leaving their religion feel even worse. And that is obviously terrible because they're the actors that this team clearly cares about this debate, and they're actually far better off on our world, even if they don't receive that money. What have I proven to you? Firstly, the churches do actually do a huge amount of good. When we take this money away from them, we limit their ability to do that good, particularly by way of charities. Second of all, we explain that you have willingly given up that money, you have got something in return, and it is just deeply unclear why you'll principally owe that money back. But thirdly, people are coerced into staying even more. They're the actors this team cares about. That knocks out literally all of their first affirmative speech. Very proud to negate.
They make it sound in that speech like this is going to make all these religious organisations just go entirely bankrupt, and they're now worried that every supporter is going to pull out all of their money and they now don't have any money to do anything with. Not that many people leave religions, especially those that are tithing particularly highly, or those who are particularly committed to paying to these religions, because those were likely to be your most dedicated supporters. Those were likely to be the ones who actually really deeply believed in whatever this faith was, because people had faith often, and that meant that they were unlikely to quit these. The people that we're probably talking about in this debate are the individuals who have individually been harmed by the church. This is not the majority of your supporters who suddenly are like, oh, well, I can get my money back, better get out now. Those people were probably not going to leave. We were talking about the people who had been harmed by the church. We were talking about the people who deserve compensation for things that have been done to them. Or we were talking about the people who perhaps had been born into it, therefore had never consented in the way they want to tell you, had paid lots of money, and then had gone, wait, I've actually self-actualized now in a way that means that I no longer believe in this. It is no longer right that that's where my money goes. I need this cushion of financial security in order to quit a community in a way that could be quite emotionally distressing for me. I think that this is something we were uniquely able to enable under our side of the house. The first thing I'm going to do here is to show you that the is to delete essentially their entire contribution, where they say this money goes to good places, therefore we shouldn't take it away. Then I'm going to deal with whether this is just. Then I'm going to deal with whether it makes organisations more coercive, and then I'm going to talk about the consent and justification. So, firstly, then let's delete their push. The first thing I would say is that, as I noted in my introduction, I think this is really unlikely to be a massive fall in money, and that was because, big institutions or lots of churches had lots of members who had lots of money and had given it to them historically. They had historically accumulated a large amount of wealth. What an individual contributes is quite low compared to that proportion. But secondly, if there are so many people leaving this institution that they are markedly damaged financially in their capacity, that probably indicates to you that it's a terrible institution. If everyone wants to quit this organization as soon as someone says, oh, you can get your money back, probably it's pretty shit. Probably it's doing really bad things. And in that case, they're probably not putting all this money towards charity. They're probably never doing good things with this money in the first place, which means that their entire harm falls out. What are the reasons behind this? Because they tell you, oh, but they're spending this money in really good ways, and that means that at the point at which you give the money back, you take it out of things like charity. The first thing to say is that we're talking here about things that you tithed. I think that often the way that people give to charity is quite separate to the way they do things like tithe. Like, I, as an atheist, can still give to charities. And what I would note here as well is that if, say, someone leaves a church and then is like, but actually I really care about the charity initiatives, they'll probably just put that money back into them or put them into other charities. Because if you actually deeply cared about those things, even if your faith changed, you probably then just went, oh, I actually think that the, Red Cross or Vinnie's or whatever is actually a quite good institution. I'll put the money back into that. I therefore think there's unlikely to be a large cost. But secondly, if they were giving to these sorts of good causes, the reputational mechanisms that they give you as to why they give to them anyway still stand, right? So it's probably terrible for your reputation as a church if you're like, well, now that someone might leave, I'm going to have to strip all my money away from the poor people that I was supporting before because, fuck them, I don't have enough money anymore, because that's literally terrible for you as a church, and it takes away your capacity to retain members, which is now something you probably care about because you don't want them to take away your money, which means you're probably likely to commit to these in either world. But the next thing to say is that I just don't think this money tends to be spent in particularly good ways when there are large excesses. I think there are two ways that it can be spent that's really bad. The first is that I think that often, especially smaller churches, can do quite bad things with their money, where they're doing things like money laundering, not being particularly transparent with who they're giving the money to within the organizations, giving really big amounts of money to particular leaders within them, or sort of embezzling it away. And I think that at the point at which you give them a legal incentive to do better bookkeeping and to be like, here's where all our money went so that we can repay you in the future if things come to that and we get taken to court or whatever, that's probably a really good thing, because it probably means you're able to get more transparency on where that money was likely to be going. You're probably less likely to see these sorts of institutions putting it towards nefarious means, which I think is in and of itself a benefit. But the next thing to say is that I think that often, even if you think that these organizations are putting this towards all sorts of causes, I would just challenge that those causes are necessarily good things, because a lot of churches and things put money towards things that are really coercive and really bad. Things like anti-trans groups, things like particular sort of hate groups. I think that sometimes we're assuming here that churches are particularly good actors. The good actor churches continue to have an incentive to do good things with their money because that was how they retained members, but the bad actor churches now have their capacity to do bad things lowered because they have less money. That was a massive win in this debate. Thank you, Team Negative, for giving it to us on a platter. Okay then, given that I've proven that they've given us a benefit here, let's deal with whether or not this makes organizations more coercive. They essentially just like, oh, well, now you're going to do things like guilt trip people into not leaving. The first thing I would point to is that that I don't think that this is the tipping point, right? Because people who are in religious organizations obviously believe in the religion that they are a part of. Priests, people high up in those organizational structures, believe in things like eternal damnation, believe in things like afterlife, believe in, all those sorts of things. I think that the reason you want to retain members is not because of your worldly goods, it's not because of your material possessions. I think it's because you don't want that person to go to hell for eternity. If you weigh up the scale of those impacts, I think that probably, churches, to the extent that they're going to be coercive, are coercive under the status quo. When Bella says, oh, but the pastor's going to tell you you're the devil for leaving. Yeah, I think if the pastor was going to tell you that in either world, they'll do it, in either world. But I would also posit that, if it's a particularly good religion, that pastor might just actually be somewhat understanding and be kind of nice. And otherwise, if they were going to do that in either world, maybe you should just leave that religion, because it sounds like it would be quite bad. But I think I would flip this, because I actually think now you have to try harder not to alienate people, which means that, because being coercive was often what lost you the most supporters. So for instance, these sorts of churches that were seeing the most breakdown of their supporters supporter base at the moment were those that were the most like coercive towards their supporters, those who demanded the most out of them. And I actually think this now changes the way that churches are likely to interact with their following. I think the first thing is that they're probably less likely to be coercive in taking money away from people. For two reasons. Firstly, because they're likely to see that, like, if they do that, there's the potential that these people are going to become sort of like, oh, well, I don't really want to be part of a, religion that's taking away 10% of my income constantly. That's something that's more likely to push people over the fence. That means they're more likely to do this in a sort of voluntary way because they don't want to risk the fact that that person is going to leave and take that money away. And I think that what that means is that, like, say, like, you are an individual who can't afford that this month, you're less likely to be forced to pay such a large amount of money. I think that money is so much more meaningful to you as an individual than it is to a church. To a church, it's a drop in the bucket. To you, that is 10% of your, monthly paycheck. That's actually a massive amount in your capacity to live as a human being. But we actually tell you this makes it easier to leave, and I think there is insufficient response to this because I think that amount of money that you get can provide something of a cushion. Because when people have to leave their institutions, religions, often their communities, their family networks, that is something that's really scary. And the idea that you're going to do that is something that's probably going to detriment your life. At the point at which someone says, at least you can recoup some of the costs that you've already sunk, at least you can now have some sort of cushion that tides you over as you try to find a new support network, as you try to emotionally recover from the fact that it's probably quite traumatic. At the point at which you try to overcome whatever damage the church has done to you, I actually think that makes it significantly easier for you, particularly in the sorts of things that are like cultish, in the sorts of places you probably never consented to in the first place. Lastly, then, let's talk about whether or not this is consensual. And they tell you that, like, oh, like, you gave this money and therefore, like, you should just leave it there. Firstly, you consented at the time. That does not mean that you consent always. In the same way that we allow people to divorce, even though they consented to getting married, that is just symmetric here. But I think that, even if, like, all the reasoning that they give where it's like, oh, you're taking this money away from like charities and things that are important and you're probably a rich person so you can afford to do it, that's just a reason why it wouldn't be justified for like a rich woman to get her stuff back from a divorce. Even if the man is perhaps poorer than her, she should still get the money that was hers in the first place because we recognize people's rights to change their mind. That was something that we should value in this debate. So proud to propose.
When Cyclone Katrina hit the east coast of America, it was the Mormon Church who mobilized a large amount of liquidity that swept in and actively were volunteering with significant reconstruction efforts on the ground. When earthquakes struck Turkey, it is the extensive zakat income that they could immediately redistribute in order to alleviate people's suffering and save children from underneath buildings. We think, even if this debate wasn't about charity that genuinely saves some of the most vulnerable people that are in desperate amounts of need, this debate may as well look like the Reformed Church in the Netherlands, which has been in chronic decline as members leave year in, year out, where bishops are already struggling to patch holes in the leaky roofs, yet alone to actually shore up their finances. We think these are types of churches that genuinely provide meaning to people in their lives. These are types of institutions that genuinely alleviate amounts of suffering. Even if Side Affirmative could prove their benefit that some people get a little bit more money here, these are not the types of individuals that are suffering the most. And that is why the first way we win this debate is by proving that our greatest moral obligation is to give money to those who are the most vulnerable in the form of charity. Opposition has 5 general responses. First is, I think they have a binary on of characterization on who gives this money. They say the devoted are the ones that are spending a large amount of money, whereas the amount of money that people that are given that are leaving out of trauma is pretty small. And immediately note this is quite concessionary to their later arguments about the types of people that leave the church not very wealthy, and therefore they're not likely to be paid out large sums of money that genuinely empowers them leaving the church. But I just think this binary is so untrue. Like, there are a large number of relatively wealthy members that are not super devoted, that have been indoctrinated to give a large amount of money, but genuinely just following the scripture and giving money through zakat. And we think that these types of individuals just empirically, in the developed world, are leaving as their education improves. They're leaving as they no longer have the same types of attachments to their church. They're not the super type of very devoted person that side opposition describes. The second argument is, look, it's very unlikely that the church goes insolvent because it has a huge amount of wealth. And this misses the point of our argument. Actually, Bella explicitly explained why the types of money that were taken away often immediately had to be from these capacities to provide different types of services and forms of charity. And that is because these religious institutions had a huge number of fixed operating costs. They had to pay staff, they had to pay to fix that hole in the roof, and those type of costs were their top priority because it meant otherwise that your staff as a bishop went unemployed and you had a very close personal connection to those type of people. They thought that their religion and their theology and having that building was clearly the most important thing. And as such, these funds were just taken and sacrificed from services. We didn't think there was this like big pot where the Vatican just like funded all sorts of different things. We think it was directly the funds that were taken from these types of people that were immediately given in forms of charity to those the most in need in those types of local communities. Thirdly, they say, but atheists can donate to charity, so this debate is not about charity. If you believe your principle that people are coerced, they need a degree of remedy, they shouldn't have given this money in the first place, then you also believe that the people that have donated money to charity in religious institutions should probably be repaid. I don't think they can have their cake and eat it too. But their fourth response is on embezzlement. And the problem here is like we have fiat. Like, if the problem here is just like, you need to be able to record their books, we'll make the church record their books without taking their money as well. Their last response is, but the church does really bad things with this money, and boy, it'd be nice to have some structural reasons. Because Bella explained that it was specifically the local legitimacy, that it was specifically the fact that the church was incredibly dedicated genuinely to its doctrine and to its scripture, which said you should give forms of charity. That these bodies that explicitly were getting income through zakat had extensive oversight from a number of followers on the ground to a huge host of different chaplains that had a stake to make sure that that money genuinely went where that money was needed the most. We think it's incredibly improbable that the church does deeply harmful things with that type of funding. And their argument that the church literally raises less money for charity because it's scared that some people will leave damningly explains why the church is less capable of genuinely helping people on the ground. It is why the church always is giving money to really vulnerable people, because it is what gets them more members. It is what fulfills their theological obligation. What we think that means is that these are the types of things that are sacrificed because they're the most expendable when you are in a tight financial position. Second way we win this debate, though, so by simply explaining that we have an obligation here, they argue that they have an obligation to repay. I think this unfortunately falls for two reasons. Their first big push is on, this is an important form of remedy, and I'm like, why is money appropriate here? Like, if this religious institution has robbed years of your life, if it has indoctrinated you extensively, why do they think that a lump sum payment is what corrects and repays for that wrong? We say the more important principle is firstly to give back to those who are genuinely suffering, to ensure that they do not have the same fate where they do not have that autonomy that you had. But it is secondly an obligation to get out of that institution earlier, to actually validate their autonomy. It seems like money is the incorrect form of remedy that side opposition describes. But it is secondly because I don't think they prove a direct link between personal harm here. There's a huge number of people that have left the Catholic Church because of child sexual abuse scandals. That is not a personal trauma that individuals have faced, and we think it's fully legitimate for them to leave, but it's unclear why those very wealthy individuals should be paid out when they are leaving. But it is last. They say, these people have been coerced to give this type of funding, therefore we should repay those type of individuals. And this is two problems. First is, all the time in society, we actually coerce people to give charity, and we think that's perfectly normal. There's a whole bunch of advertising campaigns with like starving children that are clearly in very visceral pain that obviously is emotionally coercive and tugs on people's heartstrings. Taxation is just like overtly coercive. People are just mandated to provide a section of their income to alleviate people's suffering. And we think taxation is legitimate because it has a greater moral good to the harm that is incurred. And that is why we think, to the extent that people have benefited, at least to some extent, from charity, uniquely, because religion necessarily has to interact and operate with people that are highly irrational. It is always religion that is talking to people that are grieving when their families are dying. It is religion that is inculcated into people at a young age. We have to accept that religion operates when people obviously aren't perfectly rational and obviously don't perfectly consent, but no other institution, no other moral framework can fulfill that need. And that is why we think it is okay, to the extent that these individuals have received a set of benefits from it, and to the extent that they aren't the most vulnerable individuals in this debate. Last, we think that even if none of this is true, we still have an obligation to prevent harm, to validate people's autonomy, and to help them leave these religious institutions earlier. Their big argument here is like, the money helps you leave. And as I've explained, they themselves are quite concessionary on this point, but I have 3 further pieces of mitigation. The first is there's a demographic mismatch. It is just empirically true that the vast majority of decline of religions are in some of the wealthiest countries with individuals which have the greatest social safety nets, which have some of the highest incomes in the world. It is deeply questionable to me that the types of person that is leaving out of trauma that they describe is the least wealthy that needs financial support the most. But second, it is because this forces you to do a public departure. You have to tell your bishop, I want to leave this religious institution, rather than just not attending church as regularly. And what we think that means, it incurs a greater financial cost, yet alone an emotional cost, which means that even if you get paid out some money, that just has to go towards the fact you have a harder time. But last, it's short term. You get a lump sum of payment, which shores you up for a little bit, but this just fails to actually radically shift people's capacity to leave these institutions. We think what's much more important here is how people feel. They don't leave the church because they're guilted into it. They genuinely think that there is something wrong when they receive that enormous lump sum of money on the table, when they're actively critiqued and demonized as an inherently selfish person that has prioritized that money. That is the thing that keeps them in the church, and that is what we strongly regret in this debate.
Do not conceive of this debate as formerly religious people taking money from extraordinarily wealthy churches, because we proved to you, right at Bella, and I'll respond to the extent that it gets engaged with later down the bench, that overwhelmingly this money comes from the poor, it comes from the starving, it comes from the homeless. This is food that was going to go into the mouth of someone who otherwise might have died, clothes that could go on someone's back who didn't have clothes, a house for the night for someone who otherwise would have been homeless. This is about people who are overwhelmingly from the West, people who are overwhelmingly already wealthy, people who are privileged and have the most mobility to leave their religious communities, taking money that they had donated to charity, donated to the poor, and taking it back for themselves and for their own privilege. I could not care less if it was coercive. I could not care less if they did not consent to that contract because they were coerced by that religion. It was an overwhelming moral good that we coerce those people to give to charities, in the same way that it is an overwhelming moral good that we collect tax, even though our consent to tax is imperfect. The reason why you ought to give this debate to side negative is because this team would take money from the homeless, from the starving, and from a huge range of people for whom we should care deeply about, and that is egregious, and you should never vote for a side that would stand behind something like that. 3 questions. Firstly, how does this impact the good things religions do? Secondly, do people deserve this money back? And thirdly, how does this impact people's capacity to leave the church? The first claim they make on how does this impact the good things religion do is that, well, one person's money is just a drop in the bucket and not that many people leave. The first response to this is just to point out the empirical reality of the nature of people leaving religion. That is, there are huge numbers of people leaving religions like the Catholic Church, leaving religions like Islam, and leaving religions like Judaism from the West, and those numbers affect meaningfully the amount of liquidity, amount of money these churches have to do good things in developing countries and within poor and meaningful communities. But secondly, I don't think we need to prove that this would make churches go insolvent, because $5 is a meal that someone could have had who was starving. $10, a set of clothes that someone who didn't have clothes could have worn. $20 is the amount of money that it costs to give someone a bed for a night. And the fact that the money has been taken from the church where it otherwise would have been spent on those things is a moral tragedy that you ought not support. Show some humanity, panel. You have to prioritize these benefits over the small number of benefits they provide to a set of people that we explained to you are overwhelmingly privileged. The second claim then is, well, atheists can donate to charity too. It's unclear why this money needs to go we prefer a world in which everyone gave to secular charities. The problem with this is that it requires people to redonate the money they've just collected from the church towards a set of secular charities. And this team never mechanized why people would actually engage in that. We say that the set of people who have just collected money that they had previously donated to charity, previously given to the poor, probably are doing so out of some degree of selfishness. They probably are doing so because they want that money, and the chance they redonate all of that money is extraordinarily low. But secondly, I would point out that religious charities are actually uniquely powerful. They have connections in communities and within areas of the world that other organizations simply do not. They have the trust of places in ways that traditional charities often don't, which means their power to do good is incredibly large. And maybe the only thing then that you are questioning is, well, maybe religions will cut other things and not cut their charitable efforts. The first problem with this is they need to maintain the liquidity to cover the fixed costs that they have, especially in a world in which this team implements their model, because now the expenses that that religions have gone up massively. They now have to make these repayments, which means they need money in their coffers so that when people ask for these repayments, they have it there to give it to them. And that means they need to have a lower number of expenses. And that means cutting a lot more than just fancy robes. It means cutting food that they were going to give out from a food drive. But secondly, I think the fixed costs are probably about as low as they can go for the overwhelming number of religions. Some religions, like the Catholic Church, have central organizations with lots of money, but most other religions don't. Most religions are decentralized. They operate out of smaller churches that don't have this large level of liquidity. And that's especially true of churches where people are leaving, because that's when religious organizations get their funds cut and don't have the money to do good things. But thirdly, if they are cash-strapped, consider this team at their best, and they do cut these other kinds of costs, how does this team expect them to make up that shortfall? I think the most probable outcome is that these religions now prey on the most vulnerable. They prey on their elderly members. They prey on the people who are most devoted to their faith to make up the shortfall of all of this money they've just had to repay. Which means even if this team does believe donating to a charity or a religion is coercive, now they make that even worse because they incentivize these churches to take money from a set of people that were even more vulnerable than a set of people they were taking money from before. But fourthly, even if you only believe this money goes towards administrative work, I think operating a church in and of itself is a value that we all support. Religion gives people meaning. It offers people who are desperate salvation. It enables people counseling for free when they wouldn't otherwise get it because they can go talk to their priest, because they can go talk to their rabbi, because they can go talk to their imam. That is an extraordinary good that we ought to support, even if this just goes toward the administrative costs of a church or a synagogue or a mosque. I think that is valuable. I think we ought to stand behind that payment because it offers communities that are desperate a huge amount of support where they otherwise would not get it. Their final push is, well, maybe some religions are bad. But this debate, the biggest delta, occurs in the world's largest religions. Religions like Islam, religions like Judaism, religions like the Catholic Church, who in some small instances in the past have done those things, but overwhelmingly right now the money that it gets spent on is food drives, it gets spent on homeless shelters, it gets spent on helping domestic violence victims. That stuff is valuable, that stuff is morally important. It outweighs everything they talk about. Next question then, do people deserve this money? The first question you have to ask yourself is, who are we actually talking about? And the simple question is, overwhelmingly it's rich people. Their claim is that, well, the money you would this money that it would provide you means that poor people would now be able to leave communities and religions as well. But the issue with this is that if you are poor, the amount of money that you've donated is probably quite small, which means the extent to which it gives you a safety net is also extraordinarily small. But secondly, poor people are dependent on their communities in a substantial way that a single-time payment cannot offer you a parachute out of that. It's because you don't have the education to have the job mobility to get up and leave out of a religious community. It's because you are dependent on that community as a social support network because you couldn't find one elsewhere, which means that poor people on their side don't leave. It's actually the rich people. So temper your expectations of this entire question, because overwhelmingly this is rich people in developed countries trying to recollect money from the homeless and the starving. You probably shouldn't support them even if it was coercive. The push then is that, well, it's like a marriage contract. You should be allowed to get a divorce, so you should be allowed to leave a religion. The issue with this is that it's clearly not analogous at all. Marriage is an ongoing contract that you therefore have the capacity to opt out of at any time. This was a donation. It was money that you gave to a charity. It is clearly far more analogous to something like tax, to something like donating to a secular charity. And we do not say in those instances that, well, I've become disillusioned with that charity that I donated to, I want my money back. We don't let people do that, because when they gave that money, they signed that contract, they agreed to give them that money, and that money was spent. We don't allow them retroactively, years down the line, to take that money back just because they changed their mind. These people should actually just get over it. They gave that money to them, and it stays there because that's where they put it. But secondly, Second push they give you then as well. People are coerced by the church, so we got to offer them a way out of this. I think the issue is churches are coercive and difficult to leave because they offer people a massive and incredible service. They give people the hope of salvation, something that's meaningful to people. They give people communities and safety nets. That's why they're hard to leave. And if that service is so great that people don't want to leave them, I think this makes it more reasonable to expect people to pay a tithe in order to receive that service in exchange. But secondly, many things are coercive. People have imperfect consent to things like tax, but we still allow it to be collected. And I would note this is the clearest analogy in the debate because these things are tax deductible. They're often, in many cases, at least partially, an alternative to paying tax. You instead pay it towards your religion, which seems perfectly acceptable. Next then, let's talk about the impact on people leaving the church. The issue with this is when they claim churches are already maximally coercive, I think this explains why this entire issue is broadly symmetric. But I also think we explain a way this does significantly disempower people from leaving is because now when you leave the church, you're collecting money, you're doing it for profit, and that changes the narrative around why people have left the church. It makes them seem more greedy than they previously were. And even if the rabbi or the priest was already maximally incentivized to save you from damnation because they didn't want you to leave, now it's the community as well who sees you as greedy and shuns you far more after you leave. So even if you have that safety net, it's harder for you to get by because you've lost your community. Look, this is money going from the poor and the starving overwhelmingly to rich people in the West. Even if it's coercive, I couldn't care less. We ought to give these people their money.
I'm going to start by asking the question of what do these religious institutions actually do with this money? Because this team is just so clearly operating at the extreme that benefits them the most. Because obviously churches do bad things and obviously churches do good things. So I guess we need to think about what is the thing that they do most commonly and what is the thing that happens the most often. And I think, and our team proposes, that it obviously just is the stuff like supporting natural disaster relief, because that is just far more popular amongst the average reasonable voter than increasing the salary of your pastor. And I think we are just willing to cop the bad stuff to get the good stuff, because by sheer volume, it is just so clear that the good stuff is far more likely. Because churches obviously do evil on both sides, but we empower them now to do the good stuff more. So even if they do the bad stuff a little bit more, we've explained to you that is a worthwhile trade-off, because now we get more relief on the ground to people who've been impacted by natural disasters. And their response to this is quite simple, and it's that people are going to donate in both worlds because they can just give to Greenpeace. But we explained to you at Charlie that when your money was originally being taken by Zakat and now it's being taken by your own accord, it obviously just does raise the barrier to entry to donate to charity, because at one point it was simplistically taken from you, but now you have to opt into it yourself, and that obviously just is so much harder. The other thing is all of their material is just so unresponsive to our material about the specific abilities of churches that now they lose the liquidity to do that emergency relief because they have to have that extra money in the bucket to give back to people who are now leaving those institutions. We explained to you that it's the money from the charity part of that church that leaves first, because they need that liquidity, and because declining religions are already experiencing leaky roofs as their donations have dried up. So they've already sacrificed those fixed costs and sacrificed those generous things to pay the leaders of that religion. So it is just clear that the charity is the first thing to go. Second question I'm going to ask is, why did this loss actually impact the church significantly? Because this clearly becomes a less and less important part of Affirmative's case down the bench as they realise that it would impact them quite significantly. But we just tell you that rich people are the most, in the Western liberal world, are the most likely to leave the church. And when you do give up all of those donations, that just impacts your ability so significantly. And we explained to you at Charlie that the proportional difference of $5 or $10 just is so much bigger than this Affirmative team ever wants it to be, because it can just do so much more work on the ground than they ever give it credit to do. And our burden was never to defend that churches were going to go bankrupt, but it was to defend that the incremental increase of taking this money out of the bank account of this church just would have a significant enough impact to not do it. But finally, how does this actually change the lived experience of those people who leave the church? Because I think this is where their principle is just so lackluster and uncomparative. Because even if individuals get money leaving, we explained to you that the impact of that money is just so clearly minimal, to the extent that we explained to you with structural reasons that it is the most wealthy and most privileged people who opt into leaving the church, and that this money is a short-term fix. We explained to you that now, even if the pastor is going to call you a devil on both sides of the debate for leaving, when you are actually looking at the bank account of your local church and seeing the numbers go down when that individual leaves, leaves, of course your incentive increases to call that person a devil. Of course your incentive increases to get that person to stay, because now there is a tangible impact of that person leaving, rather than just a nebulous one of having one less member. Obviously, these individuals care far more deeply about the money in the bank account of their local church to do work than they care about having that member. So obviously those levels of coercion are higher. What is the important thing that you must weigh at the end of this debate? We are willing to cop that some people are coerced into religion. We're willing to cop that sometimes churches support anti-trans communities. But we obviously prefer a world in which churches have more money, because the ratio of good to bad is just disproportionately in favour of the good. Churches do a huge amount of work. We limit their ability to do that work, and for that reason you have to vote for side negative.
Panel, we win this debate because it is not permissible to rob people, even the rich ones, or set up scams in order to make money, some of which you might then spend on the poor. But also because it is especially not okay to tell people that they're going to go to hell if they don't buy you a Ferrari. 2 contributions in this reply. Firstly, are good work still done? Secondly, how does your life change when you leave? Firstly, are good work still done? Note that this is side negative's largest path to victory. It's contingent on a couple of claims. What do they tell you? They tell you that religious organizations often do good works and that this is good. We get some emotional appeals about hurricanes, and then Eugene tells us that we have the biggest moral responsibility to continue these works because they help the people who are the ones that suffer the most. A couple of things that we do in response. The first is we dispute that these religious organizations only do good works. We tell you that they often also fund things like anti-LGBT lobby groups, that they often massively intimidate women outside of abortion clinics, that they run incredibly coercive and colonial missions, and that at that point it is actually quite difficult to ascertain the level of good that they do and how much it outweighs all of the huge harms that they are sometimes participatory to. We would also tell you that side negative cannot run away from the fact that often these very, very bad things are very culturally beneficial for these religious organizations when they have lots and lots of money, but secondly are sometimes doctrinally ordained, and that at that point they can't simply say, well, maybe they sometimes do some bad stuff on the side, but most of it is really, really good. The second thing that we tell you, though, is that it was unlikely that these kinds of good works fell over for a couple of reasons. The first was because probably quite a lot of people, notably the secular world, but also people who perhaps left those religious organizations, still cared about decreasing general suffering in the world. Liv tells you about that when she tells you that she would quite happily redonate the things that she had perhaps put into the church when she was younger if she were to leave. And that crucially, the organizations that do good works are likely to still engage. Why? 3 reasons. Firstly, secular donation to church-affiliated charities was still somewhat likely because of the level of cultural power that these things were likely to hold. So things like hurricane and disaster relief were likely to still occur because almost everyone was likely to see these things as a universal good, and therefore it was unclear to me that people would never have donated to the Hurricane Katrina drive unless the church had set it up. Secondly, that often these good works were still doctrinally ordained, and so you literally had to do them in order to be meeting your spiritual burden as a religious organization. Thirdly, because there were huge reputational incentives in order to do this. And this was something that Elanor tells you, and that then gets conceded at an egg reply, which is that it looks really, really good when you maintain your works, and that it's a really good way of retaining members. So if you're worried about losing them, you probably don't stop the disaster drives. But thirdly, note that even if you don't believe the above, this entire claim was contingent on proving that huge amounts of people left. We tell you 2 things. The first thing was that if they did, this was likely because they had reached a moral consensus that the institution was bad, and therefore we didn't think that we should support institutions like that. But secondly, that the largest religious institutions, which were often the ones who did the biggest charity and disaster drives, were wealthy, were centralized, and were wildly popular. So to mechanize any benefit, they had to engage in big religions which would not see huge loss. Secondly, how does your life change? They say that you don't get that much money, so you should just cop it. Firstly, we think this is very contingent on proving that everybody who leaves is rich, We tell you that all of our material about cults, all of our material about very, very coercive religions goes unresponded to because this does not engage with the reality that a lot of the time those people were very poor, were very impoverished. Secondly, we tell you it's principally unjust, even if these people were rich, to still force them to have their money involved in an institution they no longer believed in. But secondly, we told you that 10% or upwards of your income over 10 years was literally a whole year of income. And so at that point, it was very, very important to you and did have a huge impact on your life. But lastly, we told you it was incredibly unclear that the church got more or less coercive with this money because they cared about your internal salvation in the long run, and therefore they were unlikely to coerce you more. At the end of that, we won this debate on charitable works, but we also won this debate on impacts to the individual. Vote Aff.
Well done, everyone.